Hi buddy, Andy here again. Well, a few weeks ago I made a video called the DNA test, and I'll put a link to it below this because that will explain a lot more of what I'm talking about. But in it, brief outline of it, I was talking about this particular project. It's called the Genographic Project, and it's done by the National Geographic organisation over there in America. And the idea is to find out your deep ancestry. We're not talking about your more recent past, and I've got my family history through research and help from other people back to the 1600s, and I know I could probably get it a bit further back, and so I have some idea of where my ancestors came from outside of Britain. But what this does, this takes it right back to the sort of 50-odd thousand years ago, and the journey that your ancestors made out of Africa, because the idea of the project is that there's a genetic Adam and a genetic Eve. If you go back further enough, we are all, whether we like it or not, ancestors of a couple or of a very small group of people who go back to Africa back, as I said, 60, 70,000 years ago or something like that. And then what they can do is trace you through that. I had to send off the sample, as it said in the video, and it took about 5 or so weeks for all my results to be published, because what they do is they give you a reference number, and then you can access all of the information, and you can check up whenever you want your progress, where the sample is in the system and how it's being dealt with, and and then all the details are put on. And I was very impressed, because I didn't know exactly what I was going to get, and having seen what other people have got back from their own type of samples, different system admittedly, I was amazed, because I've got a big thing here, and this is about 6 or 7 pages long. It's even got a map on it as well, and it tells me everything that I need to know. And this starts from 50,000 years ago and goes to approximately 10,000 years ago. So I'm going to have to read some of this out, because I think it's pretty fascinating stuff. So I'm going to need my glasses. And what it tells you, because if you've done anything like this, I'll be very interested, because a lot of us are going to be related one way or the other. But it says that my Y chromosome, because we're talking the Y chromosome here, which is the male chromosome, which is passed down from male to male throughout the complete lineage of your ancestors. And it says my Y chromosome says that I'm a member of the M17 group, and there's a haplogroup which I may be explaining in a minute, which is R1a1, and I'll put some details down below, because it'd be interesting to find out if anyone else has got this done and they know that they're the same. And it says, well, I'll read sort of certain bits. It says the genetic markers that define your ancestral history reach back to roughly 60,000 years ago to the first common marker from all non-African men. So what that means is that I am related to every single non-African man in the world. Now think about that, and obviously a lot of other people are going to be in exactly the same position, but that's quite a mind-blowing statistic to start off with. My earliest ancestor is the genetic marker, which is classed as M168, and then it goes right the way through, right up to 10,000 years ago, which was M17. And it says, I'll give a brief details. It says each of us carries DNA that is a combination of genes passed from both your mother and your father, giving us traits like eye colour, athleticism, height, etc., and disease susceptibility as well. It says one exception is the Y chromosome, which is passed directly from father to son, unchanged from generation to generation, but unchanged, that is, until a mutation happens. A random, naturally occurring, usually harmless change occurs. Obviously it could be a bit more dodgy, if you want to put it that way as well. And it says this mutation, known as a marker, acts as a type of a beacon, and this is what they can track right the way through. It can be mapped through the generation, because it would be passed on from the man in whom it first occurs to his sons and their sons, and so on and so on. And it can be passed down for thousands of years, and every time one of these markers, these genetic markers, happens, that's when they can then pinpoint where your ancestors were, where that first happened, so they know where your ancestors were at that particular time. It says when geneticists identify such a marker, they try to figure out when it first occurred. As I said, and tracking the lineages provides a picture of how small tribes of modern humans in Africa 10,000 years ago diversified and spread to populate the world. So we go back right to the very beginning, and the first one that they've got of mine, the first marker, which was M168, as I just mentioned, They emerged roughly 50,000 years ago, obviously in Africa. This was when the Ice Age was just retreating, so Africa was moving from out of drought to warmer temperatures, and so people started to move out of Africa because they were able to. They weren't able to up until that time. There were roughly 10,000 Homo sapiens in the world at that time. There were a couple of other tribes. I think there were Neanderthals and there were some other people somewhere else as well, but they died out, as we'll come to. And it says the man who first gave rise to the first genetic marker in your lineage, my lineage, and possibly yours as well, probably lived in northeast Africa in the region of the Rift Valley, present-day Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, about 31,000 to 79,000 years ago. And as it says, they put the date at around about 50,000 years, and his descendants became the only lineage to survive outside of Africa. You know, that takes some getting used to, because maybe others tried, didn't make it or something, making him the common ancestor, as I said, of every non-African man living today. And it's likely that a fluctuation in the climate at that time provided the impetus, as I said, for that. It was around 50,000 years ago that the ice sheets of northern Europe began to melt, introducing a period of warmer temperatures and moister climate in Africa, and parts of the previously inhospitable Sahara Desert became habitable, and my ancestors followed the good weather and the animals that they hunted. And you go a bit further on, a few more years, a bit closer to where we are now, to a marker called M89. This was about 45,000 years ago. These go back in about 5,000 year steps, and this was in northern Africa and the Middle East. There were still about 10,000 odd people around, not many. And the next male ancestor in your ancestral lineage is the man who gave rise to M89, as I said, a marker found in 90 to 95% of all non-African people. The first people to leave Africa followed a coastal route that eventually ended up in Australia. So if you look at the map, you can see that they go around out of Africa, around, and then obviously through the Middle East and down through top of India and down through what is now Indonesia, Malaysia, etc. And that way. That's where some people went. My ancestors didn't do that. But we'll come to that in a minute. And they were part of the second great wave, so sort of different waves that went out of Africa at that time. Beginning about 40,000 years ago, the climate shifted once again, became colder, and made people move. This is all tied up with climate. So much of what we do, well, you know, in the world over the years has been tied up with the way that the climate is. We're all accidents of climate in some ways. As it says, while many of the descendants of M89 remained in the Middle East, others continued to follow the herds of buffalo, etc., mammoths and all that, onto the what is now modern-day Iran, and to the vast steppes of Central Asia. That's where my ancestors go. It says, my ancestors, having migrated north out of Africa into the Middle East, then travelled both east and west on what they call the Central Asian superhighway. We move forward another 5,000 years to 40,000 years ago, and something that was called, the marker is called M9, in Iran, Central Asia or something, tens of thousands of people once again. And it says, my next ancestor was a man born about 40,000 years ago in Iran or southern Central Asia, giving rise to the M9 marker, as he said. His descendants, of which I am one, spent the next 30,000 years populating much of the planet. This large lineage, because it's quite a large group obviously, known as the Eurasian clan, dispersed gradually over thousands of years, seasoned hunters following their herds ever eastwards along what they said, the vast superhighway of the Eurasian steppe, which is eventually, as it says, eventually their path was blocked by the massive mountain ranges of South Central Asia, the Hindu Kush you may have heard of, and the Himalayas. They got that far, couldn't go any further. And there's 3 mountain ranges there. Some people move south to the Indian and Pakistan sort of subcontinent. My ancestors then moved north into northern Europe, and as it says here, most people native to the northern hemisphere can trace their roots to the Eurasian clan. So, as I said before, there's a lot of people out there who can trace their roots this far back. Nearly all North Americans and East Asians are descended from that man. So every North American individual, I suppose, once again I am related to in that respect as well. And you know, this goes back a bit further, and also most of the Europeans and Indians as well. So, you know, this is far more tied up than what you think, but I suppose the closer you get to home, the closer you get to where we are now. Though it is like branches on a family tree, all the bits sort of divide off and go into I don't know how many markers there are, but obviously that was M9. The next one is M45, and that was 35,000 years ago in Central Asia, and it says the glaciers once again were coming back over much of Europe. At that time they reckon there were about 100,000 Homo sapiens around, and it says the next marker of my genetic lineage was M45, rose about 35 years ago in a man born in Central Asia. He was part of the M9 Eurasian clan, which I mentioned earlier on, that had moved north to the mountainous Hindu Kush region, as I said, and onto the game-rich steppes of what is now present-day Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan and southern Siberia. Yeah, so they're hunting all these woolly mammoths and that. It says, although big game is plentiful, the environment on the Eurasian steppes became increasingly hostile as the glaciers of the Ice Age began to expand once again, and the reduction in rainfall may have induced desert-like conditions on the southern steppes, forcing my ancestors to follow north to catch the game. You know, as I said, it's all climate and it's all following your food, basically. It says, my ancestors' resourcefulness and ability to adapt was critical to survival during the last ice age in Siberia, and we all know what Siberia is, and it was a region at that time in which no other hominid species is known to have lived. So everybody that comes from Siberia I am related to in some way, because they're the only people that have ever lived there, partially because of the conditions. And as it says here, the M45 Central Asian clan gave rise to many more. The man who was its common source is the common ancestor of most Europeans and nearly all Native American men as well. So it shows you the way that all these things are tied up in. So I'm related to nearly all Native American men as well. That's just a strange thought as well, in a nice way. The next one, 30,000 years ago, M207. I hope you're following all this. I know this is going to take too long, but I thought it was too good an opportunity to not to tell everybody's story, because this is the story of a lot of people who may well be watching this video as well. Maybe a bit of an inspiration to go and find out your own story. Once again, we're still 30,000 years ago, we're still in Central Asia. The glaciers are expanding once again, as I said, still around about 100,000 Homo sapiens, they reckon. But it says, after spending considerable time in Central Asia, refining skills to survive in these harsh climates, which I mentioned before, and exploit new resources, a group from that clan began to head westwards into what they called the European subcontinent. An individual in this clan carrying the new M207 mutation, one of mine, on his Y chromosome, it said his descendants ultimately split into two distinct groups, one making it continuing into the European subcontinent, as I just mentioned, and the other group turning south and making it as far as India. So it shows once again how those branches go. My group obviously went towards Europe, and it says here, my lineage falls within the first group, 173, and gave rise to the first modern humans to move into Europe and eventually colonising the whole of that continent. So we move on to the M173 mutation, if you want to call it that, or the marker, once again around about 30,000 years. So some of this is a bit sketchy, and this is a project that's still ongoing, because the more people that get involved with this, the more people that they can actually map, the more that they can trace all this sort of thing back and pin it back to maybe it's far more distinct areas or even years or groups of years, or tie it all down a little bit more. So the more people who get involved and share their results, the better it will be. Anyway, M173, once again, around about the 30,000 year mark in Central Asia. There's still a bit of an ice age going on down there as well. So when you think that's not that far away, is it 30,000 years and there's still an ice age? Still around about the 100,000 people, possibly because of the way that the climate is. And it says, as my ancestors continued to move west, a man was born around 30,000 years ago in Central Asia who gave rise to the lineage known by the genetic marker of 173. One of mine. His descendants were part of the first wave of humans to reach Europe. It says, my ancestors' arrival in Europe heralded the end of the era of the Neanderthal peoples, as I said, a hominid species that had inhabited Europe and parts of Western Asia for around 29 to 230,000 years ago. So they've been there for quite a long time, but better communication skills, weapons and resourcefulness probably enabled your ancestors to outcompete Neanderthals for scarce resources. The survival of the fittest, the old Darwinian theory. My ancestors were stronger, more resourceful than Neanderthals, and they died out or were killed off one way or the other. And then it goes on, around 20,000 years ago, the climate window shut once again. It's very fickle, this climate, and expanded ice sheets forced your ancestors to move south to Italy, Spain and the Balkan regions as well. But as the ice retreated and the temperatures became warmer, beginning around about 12,000 years ago, many descendants of the M173 marker moved north again to repopulate places that had become inhospitable during the Ice Age. That's where my people came, as I shall mention in a minute. Not surprisingly, it says today the number of descendants of the man who gave rise to the marker 173 remains very high in Western Europe. It is particularly concentrated in northern France and the British Isles, where it was carried by ancestors who had weathered that ice age around Spain. As I said, as the weather got better, they moved on a bit further and populating areas that they just couldn't have got to before because of the ice. The last one, I believe it is, I think it's the last one, yes it is, M17. This is the last one that they can track of mine. As I said, at a given time they may be able to make it better than that. M17, 10,000 to 15,000 years ago. Either what is now present day Ukraine or southern Russia. As I said, the ice age and the glaciers were retreating. Now we're up to a population of Homo sapiens on the planet of a few million. It shows how it keeps going and going and going. They were possibly the first people to domesticate the horse, because as I said, my ancestors moved into Spain and to that sort of area across Europe, but as the temperatures got better they actually went north and round again. Some obviously continued this way. It says my genetic trail ends with a marker that arose between 10,000 to 15,000 years ago, when a man of European origin, as I said, was originally in Europe, was born on the grassy steppes in the region of present-day Ukraine or southern Russia. His descendants became the nomadic steppe dwellers who eventually spread as far afield as India and Iceland. That's a big area, isn't it? Archaeologists speculate that these people were the first to domesticate the horse, as I said, which would have obviously helped with their migrations as they went on. In addition to genetic and archaeological evidence, the spread of languages can also be traced to these prehistoric migration patterns. And as it says, my ancestors, descendants of that Indo-European clan as they call it, may be responsible for the birth and spread of all the Indo-European languages, the world's most widely spoken language family. The Indo-European tongues include, and there's a lot here, English, French, German, Russian, Spanish, several of the Indian languages including Bengali and Hindi as well, and numerous others. Many of the Indo-European languages actually share similar words for some things like animals, plants, tools and weapons. So that's pretty good. So I can trace mine back to sort of 10 to 15,000 years ago. As I said, I got it personally to the 1600s. That's a bit of a gap, I know, but there's another thing here. It says today a very large concentration, around 40% of all the men living in the Czech Republic across to the steppes of Siberia and south through Central Asia are members of that same group, that M17 group. And in India, about 35% of all the people who speak Hindi population are also part of that group as well. But the M17 mark was found in only 5 to 10% of Middle Eastern men. You see the way that obviously earlier on they went off, my ancestors went off in a slightly different way and some took a different route. But the marker is also found in relatively high frequency, around about 35% among men living on the eastern side of present-day Iran. I think because of the way that the mountains are, that some went one way, some went another, and that those mountains were a barrier. So that's a bit of a long-winded explanation, but I just thought I'd put everything down. The amount of information, I've got a little map on here as well, obviously, which shows where the people went as well. If I put that up there, you can see the sort of idea of, obviously we started down here and then the way it goes up. and there's more information on the website. Fascinating stuff, and as I said, I never expected to get that amount of information. Obviously some of it's conjecture, I suppose, it's a bit of guesswork, but the more people that get involved in this, the more people who are interested in doing it and share their results, because you don't have to, you can keep them to yourself, or you can put them as anonymously as part of the project as well. But I think that's pretty fascinating. I'm amazed at that. It's fine, you know, some of those mind-blowing statistics. I'm related to every single non-African man in the world. As I said, lots of other people will be, and I suppose if you think about it logically, that's not a huge surprise, but just the way that they can move those people around and how it all works, fascinating. As I said, hopefully you might have been inspired. I shall put links down below to see if you want to have a go yourself, and who knows, we may well be related. The chances are we probably are. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for your time. I'll speak to you again soon. Goodbye.